Dawn breaks over ancient Rome, and the city stirs to life with the sounds of merchants and senators preparing for another day of empire. But in the heart of the forum, behind marble walls and veiled curtains, 6 women in white move through rituals older than memory itself. They are the Vestal Virgins, keepers of Rome's eternal flame, revered as living goddesses. Yet what the priests did to these sacred women, what they justified in the name of purity and divine law, reveals a darkness so profound that even now, 2,000 years later, the truth feels almost unbearable. This is not a story of honor. This is a story of control, of innocence weaponized, of holiness twisted into the cruelest prison ever devised by men who claim to speak for the gods. The temple of Vesta stands unlike any other in Rome. No golden idol gleams in its shadows, no treasure waits in secret chambers. Only a flame burns there, eternal and forbidden to fail, tended by hands that dare not tremble. The Vestals are chosen as children, sometimes as young as 6 years old, brought before the Pontifex Maximus and his council of priests. Noble families present their daughters like offerings, and when a girl is selected, her childhood ends in an instant. Her hair is cut and burned in Vesta's fire. Her birth name dissolves into smoke. She is dressed in white robes and crowned with woven branches, then made to speak the words that will seal her fate for 30 years. I will remain pure by will and by law. With that oath, she ceases to be a daughter, a sister, a person with a future of her own choosing. She becomes property of the goddess, a living symbol of Rome's purity, and the slightest crack in that symbol could cost her everything. To the citizens watching from the streets, the Vestals live in splendor. They ride in chariots through cheering crowds. They sit in seats of honor at the gladiatorial games. Senators bow as they pass. They possess legal powers no other Roman women can touch, the right to own property, to make wills, to free condemned prisoners with a single touch. Untouchable, everyone says, sacred beyond measure. But behind the gleaming facade of privilege lies a truth the marble walls never speak aloud. These women are prisoners dressed as priestesses, watched every moment by men who claim divine authority over their bodies and souls. The Pontifex Maximus holds absolute power over them, power to judge, to punish, to condemn. And he alone decides what the goddess wants, what purity means, and who has failed to maintain it. The fire they tend is more than ritual. Rome believes with iron certainty that if the flame dies, the empire dies with it. Every drought, every plague, every omen of misfortune sends whispers through the city. Have the Vestals failed? Has one broken her vow? The question hangs in the air like poison, and when disaster strikes, the people demand an answer. They demand a sacrifice. The priests, always watching, always listening, begin their investigation. But what they call justice is something far more sinister. To understand what happened to these women, we must go back to the methods used to ensure their purity. Methods that historians have tried for centuries to soften with careful language and academic distance. The priests conducted what they called ritual verifications, invasive examinations performed in private, without witnesses, justified as divine necessity. They claimed to be protecting Rome's sacred order, but what they were truly protecting was their own power, the ability to scrutinize, to humiliate, to control every aspect of these women's existence under the guise of holy duty. And if we find value in preserving these forgotten voices, in bringing light to histories that powerful men tried to bury, then subscribe and stand with us as we continue uncovering the truths that time tried to erase. A Vestal's life became a tightrope walk over an abyss of rumor and fear. A glance held too long at a festival, a smile misinterpreted by jealous eyes, a political enemy seeking leverage. Any of these could become an accusation, and once accused, the machinery of sacred justice ground forward with terrible inevitability. The trials were swift, theatrical performances where the verdict often existed before the first testimony was heard. If the Pontifex Maximus and his council declared a Vestal guilty of breaking her vow, Roman law presented a unique problem. Her blood was sacred and could not be spilled. So the priests devised a solution that allowed them to claim mercy while delivering a death more horrifying than any blade. Near the city walls lay a place called the Campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked. There, beneath the earth, waited a small chamber. On the appointed day, the condemned woman would be dressed in her ceremonial robes, veiled, and led through streets lined with citizens who followed at a distance, some weeping, most silent with dread. At the field, priests would lower her into that underground tomb, place beside her a lamp, a loaf of bread, and a jug of water, then seal the entrance with timber and clay. They would smooth the earth until no trace remained, and as they walked away, they would declare Rome purified. Below, in absolute darkness, the woman they had buried alive would face her final hours alone. But what happened next will shock even those who think they understand ancient cruelty. The woman left in that suffocating darkness was not always guilty. In fact, many historians now believe that most of the Vestals buried alive were innocent, destroyed not by their own actions, but by the ambitions and fears of the men who controlled them. Take Cornelia, the Virgo Maxima who served for 20 years without blemish under Emperor Domitian. When plague swept through Rome and lightning struck Jupiter's temple, the people panicked. They demanded an explanation for the god's displeasure, and Domitian needed someone to blame. The priests turned their eyes to Cornelia. Without evidence, without witnesses, she was accused of breaking her sacred vow. She stood before the tribunal and declared her innocence, calling upon Vesta herself to bear witness to the truth. But the priests had already decided. The emperor wanted a spectacle of purification, and Cornelia would provide it. On the day of her execution, she was paraded through Rome's streets, bound and ash-dusted, while citizens who had once bowed to her now averted their eyes. At the Campus Celeratus, she descended the narrow stairs into the chamber below. Ancient sources record that she stumbled once and refused the hand of the priest who reached to steady her, whispering words too soft for those above to hear. Then the earth closed over her, and Rome declared itself cleansed. Centuries earlier, another name had darkened the record. Under the rule of Lucius Metellus, a Vestal named Aemilia was accused when the sacred flame went out during her watch. She insisted it had been extinguished by the goddess's own will, not through her neglect, but her words changed nothing. The priests ruled that her failure had angered the gods, and she was buried alive, her protests smothered by soil and stone. The pattern repeated across generations. Disaster followed by accusation, accusation followed by death. And behind many of these condemnations lay motives that had nothing to do with purity or divine will. Consider the case of Licinia, a Vestal who owned a small villa, one of the few properties a woman in her position could legally hold. Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest and most ruthless men, wanted that property for himself. His solution was elegant in its cruelty. He accused Licinia of breaking her vow, knowing that if she were found guilty, her possessions would be forfeit. Licinia fought back with unexpected strength. Public opinion swayed in her favor. The tribunal hesitated. Crassus, sensing the tide turning, withdrew his accusation rather than face the scandal of an obvious lie. Licinia kept her life and her property, but the suspicion never left her. Once doubt touched a Vestal, it clung like smoke for the rest of her days. This was the true horror of their existence, not just the threat of execution, but the constant knowledge that their sacred status made them vulnerable in ways no other Romans were. The same purity that elevated them also painted targets on their backs. When emperors needed to demonstrate moral authority, they paraded the Vestals as proof of Rome's virtue. When crops failed or armies faltered, those same emperors allowed the Vestals to be offered up as explanations for divine anger. The priests, wielding their claims of sacred knowledge, became the instruments of this cycle. They held the power to interpret every sign, every rumor, every whisper into either absolution or condemnation, and their power was unquestionable, because to question a priest was to question the gods themselves, and no one in Rome survived that. For nearly 1,000 years, this system endured. Generation after generation of young girls taken from their families, transformed into symbols, watched and controlled, and sometimes destroyed by men who claimed to serve a higher purpose. But empires, no matter how mighty, do not last forever. By the 4th century, Rome was changing. The old gods were fading, their temples growing quiet, their festivals feeling hollow. A new faith was rising, one that spoke of mercy rather than sacrifice, of salvation rather than ritual purity. When Constantine embraced Christianity, the writing appeared on the wall for the Vestals and all they represented. The sacred fire that had supposedly burned since the days of Romulus, the flame that held Rome's destiny in its light, was now tended by women serving gods no one feared anymore. When Emperor Theodosius I issued his decree near the end of the 4th century, ordering all pagan practices to cease, the end came swiftly and without ceremony. The last 6 Vestals gathered in their temple as soldiers sealed the doors behind them. No crowds came to watch. No priests remained to speak the final rites. The women stood before the flame they had devoted their lives to protecting, knowing they would be the last to ever tend it. They poured the final oil, whispered their last prayers, and watched as the eternal fire flickered and died. The silence that followed was absolute. For 1,000 years, Rome had believed that if the flame went out, the city would perish, and in that moment, it did, not in physical destruction, but in the death of the world those women had been born into, trained for, and sacrificed everything to maintain. The temple was abandoned, the gardens grew wild. The names of those final priestesses were never recorded, and their fates remain unknown to history. But the story of the Vestals refused to die. Later generations, looking back through the centuries, began to see them not as servants of false gods, but as victims of a system that used holiness as a weapon. Women who were told they were sacred, then treated as expendable. Women who were revered in public and controlled in private. Women who kept a flame burning for an empire that would bury them alive the moment it suited political necessity. What do you think drove this system? Was it genuine religious belief, or was it always about control? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these voices deserve to be remembered, and their story deserves to be told. The ruins of the Temple of Vesta still stand in Rome's Forum, broken columns marking the place where that eternal flame once burned. Tourists walk past every day, snapping photos, rarely pausing to consider what happened within those walls. But if you stand there in the early morning, when the city is quiet and the light falls just right across the ancient stones, you can almost feel them still the presence of women who spent their lives feeding a fire that was never meant to keep them warm. They were called sacred, but they were made into tools. They were called pure, but they were buried in darkness. And the greatest tragedy is not just that they died for sins they didn't commit, but that they lived every day knowing their holiness was a cage, and the men who praised them were also their jailers waiting for the moment when the city would need another sacrifice and they would be offered up once more to gods who never asked for them at all.